Okay, I think we'll get started with our second part. If you need a quick cup of tea or another muffin, there might be a few left. If the tea is running out, we can certainly make some more. The leaves should be good for another set. So we pick up in chapter 20, and it's the rebellion of Sheba. In some ways, this part of the Bible starts to feel a bit more like a soap opera than a biblical text. Because in this case, so Sheba is from the tribe of Benjamin. Why would that be significant? What have we looked at so far? David's tribe is not Benjamin, but that's a good guess. David's tribe is a tribe of Judah. But why would a rebellion from the Benjaminites make sense? It was Saul's tribe. So the Benjaminites were in charge under Saul, and he had appointed a lot of them. When David takes over and it's the tribe of Judah, a lot of those people that are from Saul's tribe, the Benjaminites, probably get a bit disenfranchised, or they feel that anyway. You know, one could say that the kingdom was lost to Saul for just reasons. He doesn't do what he's supposed to, but nonetheless, that is what happens. So Sheba rebels against David. And there is this kind of feeling at the end of the book like it's just a collection of stories from the life of David. They're not necessarily in chronological order. Remember that David reigns for 33 years in Jerusalem. So even though the narrative feels like there's a lot that's happening, many of these events are actually relatively short in time span, at least as far as the book goes. Like the rebellion of Absalom, he gets proclaimed king, and then he sort of rallies an army in the city of Hebron, where he gets proclaimed king there. And then David's army marches out to meet him in battle. And then he's killed by Joab. That doesn't take very long, even though it takes a while in the narrative end of the story. So we have this series of events that are a bit just out of sequence. They're just thrown in here. And I don't think we have clear indications as to when they happen in the life of David. They happen. So this is the rebellion of Sheba. And if you note right away, the country fractures along the same lines that will happen later. So the 10 northern tribes follow Sheba, the Benjaminite, and the southern tribes, the 2, follow Judah. Now this is a little bit confusing, or they follow David. This is a little bit confusing because Judah is a single tribe, and so, like who's the other one? We talked before about how this tribe of Simeon sort of disappears from the narrative around Beersheba, and they might be the second one. It could be the Levites are being counted, like Judah and Levi. The Levites are connected with the temple. So Judah, like the ritual practice, the liturgical practice of the people in the city of Jerusalem becomes this connection with the Levites and the priests and the temple that kind of keeps them drawn together. But already at this time, you can see that the tribes are fracturing along this cultural line, and that continues to happen in the history of Israel. Solomon's son Rehoboam, who doesn't rule wisely and well and doesn't listen to his elders, he sort of gets in charge. He imposes heavy duties on the northern tribes, and they break away and form their own kingdom. And it's the same sequence, it's the same division. And it's kind of a division in geography as well. So it's Judah and the south, the southern hill country, the south and west toward the modern day Gaza Strip. The northern tribes are where most of the people live. That would be the majority of the population, that would be the majority of the area. And they're the ones that break away. So this seems like it must have happened after the rebellion of Absalom, because it talks about the 10 concubines that were connected with Absalom, and David provides for them, but he sort of kicks them out of the palace. They're on the outs with David. And then there's this intrigue with Amasa. So the men of Israel desert David. They form their own group. They form a kind of rebellion. David, after the conflict with Joab, who killed Absalom, David sort of disinherits him. He removes him from leading the army, and he puts Amasa in charge. And so David then kind of orders a census. He tries to gather Judah together. The people are slow in coming, and David sends the army under Abishai and Amasa out to fight Sheba. Here you start to see that there are divided loyalties in the army. It's like David is choosing particular groups to go out and to fight, and he doesn't seem to have quite as widespread support. Then it includes this story about Joab. So Joab had been the leader of the army, but David was afraid of him. He saw his vengeance when he killed Abner, and there's been this sort of long simmering conflict the whole time. Well, Joab wants to be in charge again. He wants to be the head of the army. And so he murders Amasa, who David had appointed to lead the people, or to lead the army. And he does so. I mean, Joab is probably a character with the complexity of David, but not his redeeming qualities. Joab doesn't have the heart and love with the Lord. Joab doesn't have the psalms that are written and this kind of balancing piece of the narrative. Joab is shown basically being a belligerent, murderous man who is ambitious and wants to be in charge. He's always kind of working on some angle to be in authority and power. And I think that should give us a bit of pause. We see this, or it's easy to forget in our own time, that there is a desire for power. There's ambition, and there's kind of a healthy sense of it in striving to do better and striving to improve yourself. That can be a good kind of ambition, but there's also wicked ambition. You know, it's power and riches and pleasure that are sort of the stereotypical snares. Yeah, would you see if you could? I wonder if they want to keep the outside door open.
Steve opened it.
Yeah, but we could close these interior doors. I'm a little bit surprised they decided to work on the sidewalk today, because it sounds like the amount of time they have before it rains is limited and fading, and like it's going to rain for much of the day. Thank you. That is helpful. So I think that we do have to be careful in our own lives. Like, one of the challenges that we face is you look at some of these sins and it's like, oh, well, I'm not in charge of an army. I don't have any ambitions. I'm not going to be like Joab. But the 7 deadly sins especially, I think it's better to be suspicious that they will happen in your life somewhere, and that it's more of looking for it and finding it than whether they're there or not. Now, certainly, you'll have your own struggles, and not everyone has the same ones. But it's amazing how often you have like people that come to church and they're, and they pray and they do all these kind of things. They look very religious, and then their neighbor doesn't spray their dandelions, and out come the fangs and the harsh words and the judgments. That kind of stuff is very common. And that's why I think it's good to look at your own heart and to look at your own life, because you probably don't struggle with sins everywhere, but you do somewhere. And I've learned this in my life as well. There's some things that do very well with, like, some kinds of material possessions I'm not very fond of, and then there's other ones and it's like, oh yeah, there's more attachments in here than I would like. And some of it, we live in this kind of culture and this kind of society where, in a way, we're able to provide for a lot of our needs, at least reasonably well. On my vacation, I listened to this series that's a rather fun series. I actually ended up listening to most of it. It's called The Oxford Medieval Mysteries, and it's about this bookseller in Oxford. And one of the things that impresses me so much is it describes some of their houses and some of their food and like the things that they have, and sleeping on a straw mat is considered somewhat of a luxury. And most of us, if we slept on straw mats, would be screaming bloody murder just about every morning at how horrible it was. Straw mats don't have a lot of cushion or give. Or they talk about like rats crawling through the ceiling because they would thatch their roofs and they weren't quite as well sealed as ours are. Just like, man, it can help us be really grateful for what we have. Because I have no desire to find rats in the ceiling. And things like envy, things like pride, they definitely are a part of our life. They're a part of human experience. And so I think it's a good thing just to ask, like, where do these kind of things grab a hold of me? Because I think if we can learn from that, if we can take it seriously, if we can wrestle with our problems here and now, then we don't have to keep committing the same kind of faults or failures. We don't have to end up like Joab does. Because it's amazing how often people think that they're doing really well, and then they're put in a position of authority, or they're put in a position that changes, and there's all kinds of stuff that comes out that isn't quite so Christian. If you remember my story from last summer, it's really amazing how well you can think you're doing and you're keeping up with prayer and stuff, and then you're on a vacation and like 3,000 flights get canceled and there's no hotel rooms and no cars available to rent, and on and on and on and on. And all of a sudden, Christianity wears quite thin. And it's easy to fall into that. You see in the story of Joab the problem of nursing a grudge. He has held on to this kind of hatred and this kind of ambition for a long time. He wants to be in charge. And so it grows over time. It becomes more and more poisonous. In a way, the only way through some of these difficulties is to face them. You have to, in a sense, stare at and fight the Goliath in your life. You have to confront it. You can't run away from it, because if you run away from it, it just gets worse and it just grows bigger. And that's true in some literal ways, if you struggle with procrastination and not doing things on time, or when you want to, and if you don't do them, your list doesn't get shorter, it gets longer, and there becomes more pressure. And then you're even less likely to do it because you feel even worse about it, and so you don't, and then your list gets longer, and then there's more pressure, and it becomes this vicious cycle. That's a little bit different than as you age, you have to slow down and you can't do as much as you used to. Like that makes a lot of sense, and that's just part of the human experience. That's part of the simplification of life. But it's good to be a bit suspicious of these things inside of our hearts because they do happen. And then Sheba, I think, is actually killed by a woman. So Joab kills Amasa, and he's trying to put down this rebellion, but it ends up that a woman is the one that kills Sheba, which is a little bit of, that's not what you want to happen. That's not what Joab wants to happen. You want to lead the army and have the glory and be, the military victor and parade into Jerusalem as the, victor king of the battle. And in this case, you sort of get second servings. You get the second plate, not the first one. Chapter 21 takes up the story of the Gibeonites. Here again, we see how David is confronted with a problem and he turns toward the Lord in prayer. And I think that's a beautiful example for us. Like I said, the text is odd because the character of David seems to bounce all over the place. But when you look at it consistently and you read some of the Psalms that accompany these moments in his life, you see that at least for much of his life, he does have this heart that seeks the Lord. He encounters a problem, and his instinct, what he does, is he asks God what he should do. And the Lord often tells him, he gives him an answer. In this case, he says, it is because of these Gibeonites that Saul wronged. So he asks them, what should I do? How can I repay you for the wrong that has been done to you? And they answer that they want death. And so he has this whole group of people killed. And again, it's just like, I don't know, it strikes our modern sensibility as being pretty awful. In this case, 7 of Saul's sons die. They're people related to him. I think they're sons of this Mephibosheth that has been a little bit of part of the story. And you see this problem of vengeance and revenge and retribution in this story very well. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It was actually meant in the time of ancient Israel to limit vengeance, that you could only take revenge on your neighbor to the extent that they had damaged or injured you. But what you see in this kind of story is that it doesn't bring healing, it doesn't bring restoration, it doesn't fix the problem. That vengeance and revenge lead to more vengeance and more revenge and more anger, and it just continues to boil. So in this case, David takes the bones and he buries them, which is another one of those. It's a deed of righteousness. This is something that the Jewish faith had a very strong sense of. The importance of taking care of the dead, of burying the dead. That's something that we are meant to keep up. And I think your generations did fairly well with it. That's something that many people still do that are older, going to visit graveyards and praying for those who have died and remembering them. For modern young people, it's almost the other way around. without a personal connection or something. There's lots of kids, for instance. I would suspect if we asked the kids at our school, there would be a somewhat significant number of them that had never been to a cemetery, outside of maybe a funeral itself, because the younger people don't have that same kind of commitment. But that runs fairly deep in the scriptures. Then it has some notes about other wars with the Philistines. And this is one where David's generals, David's army, basically send him away. That could be what causes his problem with Bathsheba. That could be what causes his issues later, is that he was kind of a warrior king. He was the leader in the battle, but the soldiers say something that seems to make a lot of sense. You shouldn't be here fighting because they might kill you, and then what would the country be? Then what would your role be? You can't rule very well as a dead man. And so they're probably acting to save him. They're probably trying to bring him or keep him safe. But that could be the source of some of his later problems, because he gets idle and he just twiddles his thumbs, and then he goes on kind of his rampages with sin. And then it does something kind of interesting. This chapter 22 takes up a text that is very, very similar to Psalm 18. And there's only a handful of times where this actually happens in the scriptures, where you have a text that's repeated almost verbatim later. There are some passages in 2 Samuel that are repeated in 1 and 2 Chronicles. If you look at the stories of Chronicles, they tell it from a bit of a different perspective. So Samuel is very much a historical perspective. Chronicles is much more concerned with worship and with priesthood and the rightness, the wrongness of deeds, the morality. That comes out in the story of Chronicles, in addition to these giant lists of names that are very, very challenging to read. I decided at one point that when I read the Bible through again, cover to cover, I'm skipping those long lists of names, because it's really hard to understand. We believe the Bible is inspired and is the Word of God, but I've struggled to make the connection to my salvation with the list of the names in Chronicles, or the numbers of people that come back from things and get sent to things. There's this many people in a tribe. Okay. There's this many people in that tribe. Yep. And this many people in that tribe. And here's all their names. Oh boy. So if you look at Chronicles, you can decide to read the story parts and not all of the names. But Psalm 18, or this chapter 22, brings out there are several lines that are beautiful and I think somewhat well known. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and horn of salvation. This horn of salvation is an idiom. Horns meant power. I will raise up for him a horn of salvation. It actually shows up, if your translation doesn't fix it, it shows up in the prayer of Zechariah called the Benedictus. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, for he has come to his people and set them free. He has raised up for us a mighty Savior. It actually says he has raised up for us a horn of salvation. I don't know if it's connected to the ram's horn. If you remember, in the story of Abraham, when he takes Isaac up on Mount Moriah and he's going to kill him, and then there's a ram and its horns are stuck in a thicket, so he takes the ram. But it seems to be something like that. I don't know if it's goats or something, but this idea that a horn is connected to power and strength runs through several biblical texts. I think this idea of the Lord as a fortress is also important as well, because we don't live today in walled cities. You don't expect to be mugged or murdered if you're driving from Fargo to Bismarck. You might expect that if you're driving in New York City or in downtown Denver. It does happen. But by and large, we live in a country that is peaceful interiorly, and you can travel great distances without worry. But that wasn't the case in the ancient world. You could argue it actually isn't the case for most of history. In many places, they closed the city gates at night, at sundown. And after that, the only way in or out of the city was usually these little holes in the wall that were only wide enough for a single person to pass through at a time. That's part of the story of a camel going through the eye of a needle. At least that seems to be an idiom, is the smaller ways into a city. But that was like your safety, your salvation, like the safety of your person was only guaranteed by the city wall. And they enforced it strictly. I mean, it was like if you were outside the wall and wanted in, very often they said, okay, well, come in tomorrow. See ya. It wasn't, people didn't do as much at night out of town because the gates would close and the highways were relatively dangerous. It's an age without security cameras and without those kind of things. And so people did get mugged and murdered. Pirates and bandits and those kind of things were major problems. You could be a merchant traveling through the countryside, bringing your wares to sell, and they would come and kill you and take all your stuff. Sometimes maybe they'd leave you alive and take all your stuff, which destroys your business and all that kind of thing. So when it talks about God being a refuge and a fortress, it means it in that kind of strong, visceral way, that it is a place of safety, and that outside of the Lord, the world is a scary place. Outside of these places of protection that are defended, it is a challenging place. Another thing that happens, which is very, very much a biblical idiom, is it talks about the coming of the Lord, which leads to signs in the heavens and on the earth. That God's presence is marked by these events that happen, earthquakes and fires and the sun being shaken and stars in the heavens. And this is one of these really, really complicated pieces, because you'll listen to all kinds of prophecy and all kinds of things about the end of time, especially if you get into the more fundamentalist Protestant circles, and some of them may very well happen. Like it talks about a third of the stars in the sky fall, and all of these other events, the sun is turned to blood and those kind of things. Could that happen literally? Yes, it could. But the Bible uses that image in two ways, and it's consistent. The first one is for the coming of God himself. They're the signs that mark the presence of God. It's meant to give you a different perspective on things like the earthquake that happens in Jerusalem when Jesus dies on the cross. It's a sign, it's a physical manifestation of the presence of God. That's one of the ways to read it. The other time where they use this idea about the things in heaven being shaken is at the fall of a kingdom, or the arrival of something new, the destruction of the world. But it means world in a different sense than we usually do. So you can look at it, for instance, and it will say those kind of prophecies about the kingdom of Babylon, when Babylon is going to be destroyed. The heavens will be shaken and the sun will go out and the land will be covered in darkness, and on and on and on. And it's clear that in that case, I think it's in the book of Isaiah and maybe some in the book of Jeremiah, what it's dealing with is the fall of Babylon. Babylon is basically wiped off the map. Once Babylon dies, it doesn't come back. At least after the second time that it dies, because there's two kingdoms of Babylon. But the one that brings the Israelites into exile, when that kingdom collapses, it's gone. And so when you encounter prophecies like that, one of the challenges is how you read it, how you hear it. Because this is talking, the earth trembled and quaked, the foundations of the heavens shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Now, God in a dark cloud and a consuming fire is an image that they carry in memory from Mount Sinai, when God comes on the top of the mountain in a column of fire and he's surrounded by smoke. So again, you have to wrestle with how to read it. Because you can read it super literally, like there's going to be this terrible belching volcano and volcanic gases and those kind of things at the presence of the coming of God. And it could be that, but maybe it's a literary image as well to describe God's majesty and his presence, that in his presence the earth quakes, in his presence the earth is shaken. I would propose to you that it's a bit of a symbolic description of their Mount Sinai experience, of that experience that's at the heart of their culture, that's at the heart of their nation, at the heart of their religion, is this time at Mount Sinai. God drew me out from deep waters and rescued me. That God brings salvation, and it is being drawn out of deep waters. One of the things that's very, very dramatic is if you see someone drowning and they can't swim, that's a pretty scary position to be in. Hopefully it doesn't happen to you. There's a goodness in learning to swim and in being careful around water. But the Lord drew me out of deep waters. What you have, in a sense, is like the darkness, the waters of the flood. You could think of the time of Noah. Many of you could think of the time of the floods here in Fargo in 97 and in 2009. Those are significant things. And when you see a body of water like that is big and angry and destroying things, I think it helps give you a sense of what being drawn out of deep waters is, being drawn out of these places of difficulty. God is a rock. This is an image of stability. Although we live in one of the places where there aren't earthquakes, I don't know how damaging it would be mentally, but it's really strange when rocks behave like they're made out of water and liquid. And that can be what happens in an earthquake, is that all this stuff that's solid under you turns kind of liquidy because of the waves that are moving through it, because of the force of something like an earthquake. It's rather strange and troubling to think about. But on the contrary, I was just in Colorado. One of the amazing things when you're standing on a mountain is just